So I'm Robert Bracey, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the collection of Sogdian coins in the British Museum. And this is a collection that Alexander Naimark has done a lot of work on. And what I'm going to talk about is primarily how the collection got to be in the museum, because I think that's an important part of trying to understand it. There are things that the collection can tell us, but there are also things that it can't because of the way it was distorted by the collection practice that was involved. There are approximately 360 Sogdian coins in the British Museum, which is not a particularly large example, not a particularly large sample. And the very first coin that arrived in the museum arrived from the collection of an English collector called Richard Payne Knight. Knight had nothing to do with Central Asia. His collection was almost entirely about European coins, and the coin that turned up in there was simply identified in his catalogue as a coin of the Greek king Euthydemus. It's in fact a Sogdian imitation of a Euthydemus coin, but as you can see, it's an imitation that looks very like the originals, and we don't know exactly how Payne Knight got it. Maybe it had made it to somewhere in Europe or the Near East in antiquity, and it's simply become mingled in with other Greek coins. As a general rule, the department showed very little interest in Sogdian coins at all throughout most of its history. John Allen was still referring to these as Yuchi coins well into the 20th century, so attributing them to the nomadic confederation that formed the Kushan Empire rather than seeing them as a distinct function of Sogdia. However, the department had begun to acquire them by 1835. It wasn't resistant to acquiring Sogdian coins, it simply didn't actively go out of its way to do so. And the very first large group it got was from Alexander Burns, who donated a collection in 1835, which he had acquired in a trip to Bukhara, which he had undertaken as part of British imperial ambitions in the region. And this is a picture of him being murdered in Afghanistan as a result of the First Afghan War and British attempts to extend their influence into Central Asia in trying to compete with Russia at the time. Most of the coins that he acquired and gave to the museum as bar coins of the 5th century, and they're awful. These are two of the best images that I could pick out from the material that we had. A little note, because it's going to come back up later, on how British Museum acquisition numbers work, which is how coins are referred to whenever you see them in publications. The first bit of the number, 1835 in this case, is the year in which the acquisition is recorded. The second part of the number identifies the collection. So in this case, that these coins were acquired from Burns. And the third one is simply a number indicating sequentially the coins in that collection. Usually, the central part of the collection is a set of 4 numbers. And when this system was introduced, this isn't how it works today, but it applies to most of the Sogdian coins. That was the month and the day on which the collection was registered and recorded in the registers. So there were 32 coins in that collection, and they mostly came from Bukhara, with a few from Samarkand, which is unsurprising. That's where Burns himself collected them from. By the 1830s, Europeans working in this region, northwest India, were actively seeking to acquire coins from Central Asia. And Charles Masson, we have letters and correspondence associated with Charles Masson. Elizabeth Errington has done a lot of work on this, and there's extensive publications about Masson's work in Afghanistan. And he tells us about commissioning people to go and acquire coins from regions he can't directly get to. And we know that coins from Sogdia are being sold in Mashhad, in Iran. We know they're being sold in Kabul and Peshawar by the late 1830s. So it seems extremely unlikely that there's a dedicated trade in antique coins in the 1830s. What's more likely is that there are existing trade networks, and the traders who operate on that networks begin to encounter English, German, French, Russian scholars in these areas who want to get hold of coins, and they realize that on their next journey, they can pick up coins that are locally found in the Bukhara area and simply bring those with them with whatever else they're carrying to turn a profit on it. But we also get people collecting. This is an example I sometimes use of the obsession that Europeans have with collecting material. This is Lady Florentia Sale. And when the British invade Afghanistan, right, it goes very badly wrong. And Lady Florentia Sale is captured, and she's held prisoner for a year in Afghanistan. When she gets out and gets back to England, she donates a set of coins to the British Museum in 1844, which include 3 Hercodes, which replaced the imitations of Antiochus in the 1st century CE and continued to about the 4th century. This is an example of one of them. So while she is in fear of her life, captured in Afghanistan during the First Afghan War, she is still keen to acquire local numismatic material and bring that back with her. She writes an account of what happens in Afghanistan. She publishes it later. I've looked at it. She never mentions in there acquiring the coins, though she does at several points talk about coins, and she clearly sees them as important indicators of political, social systems and things worth paying attention to. So in this passage here, she's meeting with the Afghan ruler, and she notices the way in which the ladies cover their costumes in coins, and that those coins indicate their importance. The favorite wife wears gold coins, the other women in the entourage wear silver. So she's very aware of the way that coins communicate political and social information. And it's almost certainly that's causing her to actively try and acquire these in order to understand and to represent to an English public the place that she is visiting, or the place that the men she is accompanying are attempting to conquer, and she is captured in. And a lot of what we see in the British Museum collection is a complicated entwinement between colonial authority and power and attempts to understand the regions that they're moving into and the coins that we get. So these are 7 of the collectors in the 19th century, and you can see that 3 of them are military officers who all of whom participate in the First Afghan War and appear to acquire Sogdian coins in the process of doing so. 4 of them are directly involved with the colonial apparatus in India, and appear to acquire coins through trade coming from Central Asia into India. Rudolf Hernal is an example of this kind of person. He's a German philologist, and he acquires coins in the late 19th century, and he leaves records of how he acquires them. And he does it by writing to colonial officials who are working on the frontiers and asking them to acquire coins to certain patterns from local merchants, which they do, and then send them to him. And the British Museum has his coins because those coins go from him to the nascent British Indian state, and the Secretary of State for India then gives those coins to the British Museum, and those include Euthydemus imitations and Antiochus imitations, but they're mostly Hercodes coins. Again, Hercodes coins dominate this early group of acquisitions, and I'll come back to saying a little about why maybe that is, but I think we should be very careful of assuming that's because they're the most common coins that are available. Alexander Cunningham is the biggest single donor of Sogdian coins to the British Museum. He makes 4 donations between 1857 and 1894, and those contain, I mean, there are thousands of coins in those donations, but they contain 106, nearly 1/3 of the Sogdian collection. And they also contain the first significant group of coins associated with Kesh, including Alexander imitations. This Alexander imitation here, and these 6 here. These are 7 of the 9 Alexander imitations that are in the British Museum, so it's a massively disproportionate number. I understand from Alexander Naimark that this is nearly half of all the Alexander imitations that are known come from essentially this single donor acquiring coins in the late 19th century. And it seems unlikely that these are just a hoard of this material that he got. The patterns vary. There's no die duplication. For anybody who's wondering, the middle 2 coins in the image, their obverses look like they're the same die, but they're not. They're just very similar. They're probably cut by the same hand. So all of that indicates that these were probably acquired from different sources. So how on earth does Alexander Cunningham end up with so many of these? And I think the answer is that they are imitations of a type of Alexander. And Cunningham is actively seeking out Greek-style coins. Merchants seem to be, they can't not be aware that their British buyers, primarily British buyers, are obsessed with classical imagery, and they disproportionately seek out and actively acquire Sogdian coins that contain elements that appear to be derivative of classical imagery in order to sell them in India to these English buyers who are actively seeking out those particular types. So the image that these colonial investigators are getting of Sogdia is not just distorted by what survives or what they can acquire. They themselves are actively constructing it. They want to see Sogdia as they understand it from the stories of the life of Alexander, and they actively seek out numismatic evidence that speaks to that story they're already aware of. By the beginning of the 20th century, we are starting to get collections that are arriving with Sogdian coins in them that are formed entirely in Europe. So they're no longer formed by colonial officials. Parkes Weber is a doctor and a medical pioneer operating in London. He never travels to this part of the world. He is able to simply acquire examples of Sogdian coins and coins from South Asia from dealers in Europe who are actively now bringing them back to the UK because there's a ready market for them. These are some of the examples of the coins in his collection, and we can see there's a variety of types. So whereas earlier, when we see colonial examples, we'll often find that in any particular donation, Bukhara or Samarkand or one of the other states dominates, Parkes Weber is now able to get a wide mixture of coinages representative of the iconographic types from Sogdia. Again, iconographic types because people are seeking out what they're constructing an image of Sogdia that focuses on it as the periphery of the classical world. Just a quick note, this is why it's really useful to understand the acquisition numbers and how they're used in museums. You'll see that those numbers are all over the place. The numbers aren't assigned by the collector before they arrive at the museum. They're assigned by the museum when it does its initial sort. And you can see they're not grouping this material together. It's getting scattered across the collection, across the whole collection, and they're not seeing it as a singular set representing Sogdia. That takes a lot of time to develop inside the museum. Now, before 1945, the museum makes 41 acquisitions that contain Sogdian coins. There are only 4 acquisitions that take place after 1945. So there's no opportunity for the museum to correct that colonial bias that exists in its collection. 2 of those occur in 1946, so they're really part of the pre-1945. And the museum does not make a dedicated purchase of Sogdian coins until 1998, and that is the last group of Sogdian coins to be acquired. In 1968, the museum gets 3 coins from the German numismatist Robert Goebel, who, of course, wrote an extensive treatment, Iranian Huns, on Central Asian coinage, and almost certainly acquired these in the process of doing that. So these are coins acquired in a very different pattern to the pattern before 1945. They're acquired in order to be studied in a much more modern numismatic sense. But you can see how the pattern that was established before 1945 impacts them. You're dealing here with essentially 3 different versions of portraiture. The last set that's acquired is 39 coins in 1998, which are actively purchased for the same reason of trying to develop the museum's collection of Sogdian coins for the purpose of using the coins as a way of studying Sogdia. And they are, again, a mixed group, Samarkand archers, Asbar coins, Hekodes, the Nakshab lion slayer, as we saw in the previous thing. Here are those types, and so the collection, now, exactly how you attribute them is obviously something of an open question with Sogdian coinage. I'm using some data that Alexander Naimark prepared about 6 or 7 years ago, which was very provisional, but you can see that there's a mixture favoring Bukhara strongly and then Samarkand, which I think, having seen the way in which the coins are developed, we should see as representing the areas that traders who supplied the market were able to access, not as a reflection of the actual circulating patterns of Sogdian coinage. I've also broken it down by date on the right-hand side, but again, caution in the same way. There is a tendency for the collection to favor earlier coins, those that are imitative of Greek designs, and to favor coins of the 1st, 2nd century, which is the period in Sogdian coinage where we see innovative design rather than imitative design. So rather than just copying immobilized pre-existing types, people are introducing new legends, developing new portraiture, which again is a function of the way that the people involved are using coins as a way of trying to understand a place that they're not directly visiting in most cases, but also it means that people are constructing that place through their already existing assumptions. So in the last talk, we saw examples of Chinese-style cast coins from this general region. Those are almost completely absent from the British Museum's collection. So the British Museum has a collection that sees coins which imitate Greek examples as a legitimate representation of Sogdia, but excludes coins that imitate Chinese examples. So it sees only half the picture of Sogdian coinage. And I think anytime we use collections and every time we look at collections, we need to bear that in mind. It's fantastically useful to have research on Sogdia that reconstructs how these coins were used and where they're found and who they're made by, because what it does is it throws into stark relief the coins that we have in European cabinets. And in the process, it begins to tell us something about the European collectors and the way they thought and the nature of collecting in the situation of either a colonial state or the rivalry of Russia and Britain in Central Asia. And that ultimately is something this collection is far better at telling us than it is actually at telling us about Sogdian coinage itself. I hope that was of some interest to people, and thank you for listening.